Hey, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Gimel of Masechta Yoma. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff on this daf. Yeah, I don't know. What do you want me to tell you? Not like that much, but there also kind of is. I don't know. What do you want me to tell you? So the gist of the daf, for most of the daf, we're really continuing with our discussion of how do we know that when the pasuk says by miluim lichaper, it's a reference to Yom Kippur and not maybe something else. Yesterday we entertained the notion that maybe it could be talking about Korbanos, or maybe more specifically Shalosh Regalim, or maybe more specifically Shmini Atzeres. And sort of we didn't succeed proving any of those, so we're kind of still assuming that Lichaper is Yom Kippur. Today we're going to continue on that discussion. We're going to suggest maybe Rosh Hashanah, maybe Shavuos. So we're going to continue on that. And what else? And then at the end, Rabbi Yochanan, we see we discussed the chiyuv for separation, for quarantine for Para Aduma. We see Rabbi Yochanan's opinion there, and also the kind of machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish at the end about where we learn the prishas out from. We'll get there. Anyways, that's what's in store for us today on Daf Gimel. Yeah, it's not like a lot of big sugyas per se, but I don't know, for some reason there's a lot of stuff. So let's get started on this stuff. So interestingly, I'm still in the United States of America. I don't know if you could tell my tone of voice or whatever, but al kopanim. So interestingly, when I came to the United States, we were learning Masechta Eruvin. And I figured there's no way that I'll still be here by Masechta Yoma. So I didn't bring a Masechta Yoma with me. So I'm using my brother's. Now, the thing is, I don't know, it's a very similar, it's like the same publisher and everything, but there are slight differences, and one of them is that my Gemaras for some reason tend to have random periods interspersed, which tend to be good places to stop. This Gemara, I don't know if it's because of Masechta Yoma or because of its version of the Gemara, but it doesn't have those periods. So I thought that where we stopped yesterday was a good place to stop, but it actually turns out it was kind of in the middle of something. So, therefore, what I'm trying to say is that we're shtickle in the middle. So what were we talking about at the end of the daf yesterday? At the end of the daf, we were trying to say that maybe when it says in the pasuk L'chaper by the Miluim, it's a reference to Shmini Atzeres. That just like by the Miluim, there was 7-day quarantine before that 8th day, which was the first day of Nisan, which was when Aharon and his children began offering the korban of the Nesiim, and it was when they began being the Kohanim to serve in the Mishkan. So there was 7 days of quarantine prior. So we wanted to say that maybe just like by the Miluim there were 7 days of quarantine, so maybe talk about Shmini Atzeres, whoever is going to do the Avoda in the Beis HaMikdash for Shmini Atzeres would have to quarantine first for a week. And we ended up saying that, well, the thing is, leading the 7 days prior to the Miluim were just regular days, and we therefore want a festival that has 7 regular days leading up to it, as opposed to Shmini Atzeres, which the 7 days prior are Sukkos, are Yom Tov. So therefore, it can't be talking about Shmini Atzeres. The Gemara then said that, well, I'll tell you a kavachomer. If when there's only 7 days, regular days leading up to a festival, and it needs quarantine, kavachomer, when there's 7 days of festival leading up to another festival, it should require quarantine. To which Rav Misharshia said, no, the pasuk says, right, Bayom Hazeh l'chaper aleichem, in the context of Miluim. And therefore, it has to be exactly like this. No fancy kavachomers, no svaris, just like by Miluim, it was a bunch of regular days leading up to the days of Miluim. So the same thing is what we're looking for as a similar case, which Yom Kippur fits the bill, Shmini Atzeres does not, because there's 7 holy days leading up to the 8th day. Now, we get up to Rav Ashi's opinion. Rav Ashi says the reason why you cannot learn enough from Shmini Atzeres is Beis and Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Rav Ashi Omer says, Rav Ashi miika midi de ikar regel lo bai prisha tafel di de bai prisha. Is there anything? Does it make any sense to say that we would have a situation where the ikar regel, the main regel, what's the main regel by Sukkot? Sukkot, the first 7 days of Sukkot. Is it possible to say that for the first 7 days of Sukkot, you don't have to quarantine 7 days beforehand if you want to do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash? Tafel didei bai prisha, but that which is sort of secondary to Sukkot requires a 7-day quarantine. Kilu, if you don't have to quarantine for 7 days before Sukkot to do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, it doesn't make sense to say that for Shmini Atzeres, which is sort of secondary to Sukkot, you would have to quarantine for 7 days. What's the Iker and what's the Tafel? The Iker is the Sukkot. If you don't have to quarantine for Sukkot, certainly you don't have to quarantine for Shmini Atzeres. And even according to, right, maybe people are thinking, but what do you mean? Shmini Atzeres Regel B'fnei Atzmo. Shmini Atzeres is its own thing, right? In the Tfilis, in the Shmona Esrei, we say B'Shmini Atzeres Chag Hazeh. Or maybe it's B'Shmini, or Chag HaShmini Atzeres, I don't know. Sometimes it's one, sometimes the other. Akoponim. So it's its own festival. It's its own holiday. So why are you saying that it's Tafel to Sukkot? It has nothing to do with Sukkot. It's its own holiday. But no, even according to Mada Amr, Hanamidadin in Pezer Keshev, that's only in certain ways it's considered its own holiday. Pezer Keshev, Rashi goes through what all these things are. Pezer is the lots in the Beis HaMikdash, separate lots in the Beis HaMikdash. During the Regel, there's generally no lots. In general, in the Beis HaMikdash, every single day there were lots in order to see who's going to do the avodah. Now, on the Shalosh Regalim, it wasn't like that. There were no mishmaros in the Shalosh Regalim, just everybody comes to do the avodah. There's no specific mishmaros. But however, regarding lots, there's lots once again on Shmini Atzeres. Zayin is Zman in terms of Shechianu. We say separate Shechianu for Shmini Atzeres. The Reish is Regel B'fnei Atzmo. It's just considered its own Regel. The Kuf means Korban. It's the Korbanos of Shmini Atzeres are different than the Korbanos of Sukkot. The Shin is for Shir. It has its own Shir Shel Yom. And finally, Beis means that it has its own special bracha. Fine. Now, so Shmini Atzeres is considered its own festival regarding Pezer Keshev. Aval, Linin Tashlumin Derishonu. But regarding Tashlumin, who can tell me what Tashlumin is? Tashlumin is that whenever there's a Shalosh Regalim, so you bring a Korban Chagiga, not talking about the Chagigas Yudala that we know that we would eat as the main meal by the Korban Pesach. No, there's a separate Chagiga. There's a whole Masechta called Masechta Chagiga. Mistam, we're going to learn about it during Akoponim. Whenever you have the Shalosh Regalim, so you bring a Korban Chagiga. Now, if you didn't bring the Korban Chagiga on the first day, I don't know, either you didn't Chaperein or because it was Shabbos, you don't bring the Korban Chagiga on Shabbos. So if you didn't bring the Korban Chagiga, so then you have what's called Tashlumin. You could make up for it the rest of the Chag. So the rest of the Chag, if you didn't bring the Chagiga, you could bring it, on any of the other days. Now, interestingly, when it comes to Shavuos is only one day. So even though Shavuos is only one day, the following 6 days you could still bring your Korban Chagiga if you didn't bring it, which is why nowadays we don't say Tachnun for a week following Shavuos. Now, anyways, so with regard to Tashlumin, interestingly, Shmini Atzeres is just considered part of Sukkot. So if you didn't bring your Korban Chagiga on the first day of Sukkot, you could bring it any of the following 6 days, plus Shmini Atzeres. So we see that Shmini Atzeres is really considered part of Sukkot. So in some ways yes, in some ways no. And therefore, Rav Ashi is saying, look, L'maisa we're going to consider Shmini Atzeres to be Tafel to Sukkot. And if you don't have to require Prisha quarantine for Sukkot, you certainly don't have to require quarantine for Shmini Atzeres. So that's Rav Ashi's take. Okay, fine. So, let's go weiter, Shtickle. The Tanan, we learn in the Mishnah, Mishlochog. If somebody didn't bring his Korban Chagiga on the first day of Sukkot, so he could make up for the Korban Chagiga on the following 6 days. Plus Shmini Atzeres, you can also offer your Korban Chagiga on Shmini Atzeres if you didn't Chaperein. Okay, so Shmini Atzeres is out of the picture according to Rav Ashi and according to Rav Misharsha. As far as we're concerned, Shmini Atzeres does not require quarantine beforehand to do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'ema Atzeres. What about Shavuos? Shavuos, after all, is one day. The Friesha Shiva Liyom Echadu. Perfect. You quarantine for 7 days for one day. So it's not like Sukkot or Pesach where it's a 7-day shindig. Shavuos is one day. Miluim was one day. Miluim had 7 days quarantine beforehand. Let's say that Shavuos has 7 days quarantine beforehand. Reb Abba, Done par echad v'ayil echad mi par echad v'ayil echad lafuke atzeres t'shnei elim ninhu. So says Reb Abba, I'm going to read that again. Done par echad v'ayil echad, we learn out a par echad v'ayil echad, i.e., on Yom Kippur, we offer one cow and one ram. Mi par echad v'ayil echad, we can learn that out from Miluim, where there was an offering of one cow and one ram. Lafuke atzeres, to the exclusion of Shavuos, Dishnei Elim Ninu, where you taka offer two rams. And therefore, it's going to be excluded. We're looking for one cow and one ram, not two rams. Well, okay, that's going to work out just fine if in fact you assume that on Yom Kippur there's only one ram. But according to Mandar who says that taka on Yom Kippur we're offering two rams, well then what makes Yom Kippur any better of a candidate than Shavuos? According to that opinion, both Yom Kippur and Shavuos have two rams. So why should I prefer to say that Yom Kippur requires quarantine and not Shavuos? So Enfert the Gemara, the Tanya, not Enfert the Gemara is explaining what this machlokas is. The Tanya is, we learn in the Brisa, Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe, Ayil Echad, that on Yom Kippur, there's only one ram, according to Rebbe. We have two places in the Torah where it references a ram on Yom Kippur. One in Parshas Achremos, and the other in Parshas Pinchas. So according to Rebbe, the ram mentioned in Parshas Achremos and the ram mentioned in Parshas Pinchas is the same ram. And therefore it's only one ram on Yom Kippur. And of course, therefore it's a good parallel to Miluim. However, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Omer, says Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, Shnei Elim Heim. There's taka two rams on Yom Kippur. Echad Omer Kan, ve'echad Omer b'chumash hapikudim. There's one ram that is mentioned in Parshas Achremos and Sefer Vayikra, and a separate ram that's mentioned in Parshas Pinchas and Sefer Bamidbar. So according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, why should we assume that Lechaper is a reference to Yom Kippur? Can it be a reference to Shavuos? Both Yom Kippur and Shavuos are 7 days, would theoretically be 7 days of quarantine for 1 day of festival. So why should Yom Kippur be any better than Shavuos? According to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who says that both Yom Kippur and Shavuos have two rams anyways. So, and for the Gemara, Afilu Tamer Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. You can even say that according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, we would prefer Yom Kippur over Shavuos. How come? Because Hasum Chad L'Chovas Hayom V'Chad L'Musafin Lafuke Atzeres T'Tavayu Chovas Hayom Ninu. Okay, a little bit subtle. Let's start with Shavuos. On Shavuos, of course, we offer the offering of the Shtei Alechem, these two loaves of wheat bread that come from the New Year's wheat. Fine. Now, with the Shtei Alechem, with these two loaves of bread, you bring two rams. So there you have it. That together with the Shtei Alechem, you're bringing two rams. Now, these rams are not musafin, they're not a korban musaf, they're just rams that you bring on Atzeres because you bring the Shtei Alechem, you bring two rams. Now, on Yom Kippur, even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who says that there are two separate ram korbanos, they're not both the same thing. One of them is for the korban musaf, and one of them is for Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur, a part of what we do on Yom Kippur is we bring one of these rams, plus there's also a ram from the korban musaf, but they're not two rams being brought for the same purpose, right? Whereas on Shavuos, you have two rams being brought together with the Shtei Alechem as part of the Chovas Hayom. That's what you do on Shavuos. Part of what you do on Shavuos is you bring the Shtei Alechem, you bring two rams. It's slightly different when it comes to Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who said that these two rams are separate rams, but they're not both for the Chovas Hayom. One of them is a korban musaf, and the other one is a Chovas Hayom as part of the offerings of the day. According to Rebbe, there's only one ram, and it's for the musaf, and that's it. So therefore, even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, we could still make the comparison between Yom Kippur and the Miluim and say that there's one cow and one ram, because even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, there only is one ram for the Chov HaSayom, for the day obligation of Yom Kippur. The other one is a Korban Musa. And therefore it excludes Shavuos, where there are two rams that are brought for the same purpose, for the Chov HaSayom, together with the Shtei Alechem. So, Shavuos is out of the picture. Next, V'em Rosh Hashanah. The Prisha Shiva L'Yom Echad. What about Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah is one day. So why don't we suggest that you quarantine for 7 days, and then there's Rosh Hashanah. Amar Babo, says Babo, no, don't do that from Rosh Hashanah. How come? Don't par v'ayil shelo, mipar v'ayil shelo, lafukei atzeres v'Rosh Hashanah, tetzibor ninu. Okay, says Babo, rule out Rosh Hashanah. How come? Because by the Miluim and by Yom Kippur, the common thread is that the cow and the ram belong to him, belong to the person offering the offering, specifically the Kohen Gadol, right? In by the Miluim and by Yom Kippur, it's Aharon HaKohen, the Kohen Gadol, bringing his own cow and his own ram, as opposed to going back to the example of Shavuos or Rosh Hashanah, that in those cases the cow and the ram are coming from the community. Well, that is all fine and good if you assume that that's the case. That's all fine and good if you assume that by Yom Kippur and that by the Miluim, he really is bringing his own cow. But, right, what does it say by the Miluim? It says, "Vayomer el Aharon kach lecha ego ben bakar lechadas v'aylo tamim bakar v'fnei Hashem." So, if you assume that when it says kach lecha, then it means yours, your own. Sure. And when the pasuk says in a different context, by the chatzotzos asei lecha shtei chatzotzos kesef, it means from your own. Sure. However, it's taka machlokas. There is an opinion that when it says asei lecha and kach lecha, it doesn't mean from your own property. It means from the communal property. Well, in that case, then the Miluim at least, and does it say kach lecha also in the context of, I'm not sure that it says kach lecha necessarily in the context of Yom Kippur. However, by the Miluim it certainly says kach lecha. And therefore, our proof is that, well, it says kach lecha, therefore it has to be yours, and therefore, and certainly, as we're going to prove in a minute, by Yom Kippur, Aharon is bringing one par and aisle from his own property. So we want to say that by Yom Kippur and by Miluim, he's bringing his own animals, whereas by Shavuos and by Rosh Hashanah, it's communal animals, and therefore apples and oranges, you can't compare them. However, says the Gemara, that only makes sense if you assume that kach lecha actually means that it's coming from your own. But it's a machlokas, as we're going to see in a second. There's an opinion that kach lecha could mean mishal tzibur. And if that's the case, then by the Miluim at least, he was bringing an offering from the community, so then we should be able to draw the comparison to Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos. So if you say that kach lecha means from the communal offerings, from the communal animals, well then, we should be able to say that Miluim is communal, Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos are communal. Why can't we make the comparison? So the Tanya, as we learned about, it's a kach lecha mishelcha v'asei lecha mishelcha, that when the pasuk says kach lecha means yours, asei lecha means yours, vikchu elecha mishal tzibur. When it says elecha, by vikchu elecha shemen zayzach, so that is communal. Divrei Rabbi Yosha, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yosha. Rabbi Yonasan Omer, whereas Rabbi Yonasan says, bein kach lecha ben vikchu elecha mishal tzibur, that both lecha and elecha means communal. Matam lomar kach lecha. So then why does it say kach lecha? Why in one place it says lecha, the other place it says elecha? So listen to this. Kaviyachol. It's as if to say, Mishalcha nirotze yosem mishalem, that the Eibishter was upset at the Bnei Yisrael, and it was Kilu, he was saying, I would prefer that you take from your own, as opposed to take from Bnei Yisrael. Even though really it is communal, according to Rabbi Yonason, the Eibishter was upset at the Yidden, and he didn't want to say take it from the Yidden, because he was upset with them, so he says take from yourself, as if the Eibishter doesn't want to receive from the community, he only wants to receive from Moshe Rabbeinu, or from Aharon. Well, in this case, I think it would be Moshe Rabbeinu. Abu Chanan Omer, it says Abu Chanan gives an example of this. Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Kasav Echad Omer, one pasuk says Vasisa Lecha Aron Eitz. One pasuk says that you will make for yourself an Aron out of wood. And another pasuk says that they will make an aron out of shitim wood. Okay, it's that. How come one pasuk says you will make it, the other pasuk says they, the community, will make it? Well, it depends. That if the Yidden are doing the will of God, so then they should make the ark. It should come from them. The Eibishter wants to receive it from them. But if the Yidden are not doing the will of God, so then God says to Moshe, make for yourself an Aron. That he doesn't necessarily want, he's not in the mood to receive it from the Yidden. And therefore, going back to our original question, this was all to explain Rabbi Yonason's opinion that Aseh Lecha and Kach Lecha means Mishal Tzibur. And Lecha is only Kilu if Hashem's upset. Now, so, therefore, back to our original question, why don't we say that when it says L'chaper Aleichem by the Miluim, what's that coming to include? It's coming to include Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara also says Atzeres. We already disproved Atzeres. Let's stick to Rosh Hashanah. So, why don't we say that's talking about Rosh Hashanah? Initially we wanted to say, Rabbi Bo wanted to say, no, you can't say it's talking about Rosh Hashanah, because the Miluim it says Kach L'cha, take yours. So it has to be yours, and Yom Kippur is yours, to the exclusion of Rosh Hashanah where it's communal. But apparently it's not so simple that Kach L'cha means yours. Kach L'cha can mean communal, according to Rabbi Yonason. And if it means communal, so then Miluim were communal, why don't we compare it to Rosh Hashanah, which is also communal? So Anfert the Gemara, the Gemara answers, listen to this. The machlokas between Reb Yosha and Reb Yonason does not apply to Yom Kippur and Miluim. The machlokas between Reb Yonason and Reb Yosha is regarding kichos de alma vasiyos de alma. General, when it says kach in a general sense, and when it says asay, make in a general sense. What is this? So kichos de alma kach lechosamim. So what's an example of a general taking? Take for yourself spices, right, by the Ketores. Asiyos de alma, what's the general making? Asay lecha shtei chatzotzus kesef. When God says to Moshe, make for yourself 2 chatzotzus of silver. So in those cases, it's a machlokas, Rabbi Yosha and Rabbi Yonason. When it says lecha, does it mean from the community or does it mean from your own personal? When you make kitaris, is the spices your own personal spices or is the spices the community spices? When you're taking silver to make these trumpets, does the silver belong to you or does it belong to the community? Machlokas, Rabbi Yosha and Rabbi Yonason. Aval, hanach parusha kamafarish de mishal chahu. However, when it comes to Yom Kippur, when it comes to Miluim, it's clear that it's a reference to their own. It's going to be Aharon HaKohen's animals. How come it's clear? B'Miluim, Michdei. Let's see, what does it say by Miluim? Ksiv, on the one hand, the pasuk says, Vel B'nei Yisrael Tadaber Lemor. Speak to the B'nei Yisrael. Sir Izim L'chatas. Take a goat for a korban chatas. Vayomer laharon kach lecha egel ben bakar lechatas. And then it says, was it immediately afterwards? Immediately prior. In the previous pasuk, it had said that God says to Aharon, take for yourself a calf as a korban chatas. So meaning, we have two psukim, one after the other. One says, Aharon, take a calf as a korban chatas. And the pasuk immediately following says, and for the Bnei Yisrael, take a goat for a chatas. Now, what do you guys think? How come in one pasuk, the instruction is to Aharon to take a korban chatas, and the other pasuk is to take for the Bnei Yisrael a korban chatas? They seem to be two separate things. There's one for Bnei Yisrael, one for Aharon. So lamali, what's pshat with the korban chatas for Aharon, the separate korban chatas for Aharon? Shma mina kach lecha mishalcho. Means yours. Take your own personal one. There's the communal one from Am Yisrael, and then the Torah is specifying that Aharon should take his own korban chatas, and it's from his own personal property. So there you have it. By the Miluim, when it says kach lecha, take for yourself, a mamish means from your own. B'Yom Kippurim, michdei. By Yom Kippur also, michdei, let's see. The pasuk says, "B'zos yaver Aharon el hakodesh b'fay ben bakar lechatas v'gomer." One pasuk says that Aharon will come into the kodesh, to the heichal, with a par ben bakar lechatas, a cow for a korban chatas, and another pasuk says, "Meis adas b'nei Yisrael yikach shnei sirei izim lechatas v'ikav v'sapar chatas asher lo lamali." And then when the next pasuk says, and that from Bnei Yisrael he will bring a goat for a korban chatas, and he brings his own korban chatas. Lomali, what's pshat with that pasuk? Right, that's all one pasuk. Right, Meisadas Bnei Yisrael yikach shnei siraizim l'chatas, and then the very next pasuk says v'ikav v'sapar chatas asher lo. So we see in the context of Yom Kippur also we're talking about his own korban. Right, as it said, "B'zos yover Aharon el hakodesh b'fay ben bakar lechatas," with a cow for a chatas. Then there's the other pasuk made adas b'nei Yisrael yikach shnei sirei izim lechatas. What's going on? V'ikav v'sapar chatas asher lo. Sounds like we're talking about two separate chatases over here. One for Bnei Yisrael, one for Aharon. So Shma Mina, Haylo Mishalo. So what it says, his, and Mamish means his. So therefore, we've proved that by Yom Kippur and by Miluim, Aharon was bringing his own korban, as opposed to Rosh Hashanah, where it's a communal korban. The korban comes from the community. And therefore, when we have the Miluim, and the Miluim requires 7 days of quarantine prior, and we're looking for a parallel case, Yom Kippur is going to be a better fit than Rosh Hashanah, because both the Miluim and the Yom and Yom Kippur have a common thread that the offerings are coming from the Kohen's personal property. That is Rav Abahu's opinion. Rav Ashi Amar says, Rav Ashi done in Pai Lechatas v'ay le'olam, in Pai Lechatas v'ay le'olam, lafuk Rosh Hashanah v'atzeres tevayu olos ninu. Let's read that again. It says Rav Ashi, done in Pai Lechatas v'ay le'olam, we learn a cow for a korban chatas and a ram for an ola, mipai lechadas v'ayil leola, right, which is on Yom Kippur from the Miluim, where also it's a cow for a chatas and a ram for an ola, la'afuke Rosh Hashanah, to exclude Rosh Hashanah v'atzeres and Shavuos, the tarvayu olos ninu, that both the rams are for olas. Not that both rams, but both korbanos are for olas. I guess the cow and the ram. So therefore, a little simpler than the previous one, which is Rav Ashi says that Yom Kippur and Miluim are a better match because you have a cow for a chatas and a ram for an ola. Same thing, as opposed to Rosh Hashanah and Atzeres, where it's both olas. All right. Ravina Amr says, Ravina done an avoda b'choyin gadol, me avoda b'choyin gadol. Lafukulu kushiyos and lav avoda b'choyin gadol ninu. Says Ravina, look, the common thread between the Miluim and Yom Kippur is that both by the Miluim and Yom Kippur, the avoda is being done by the Kohen Gadol, to the exclusion of Rosh Hashanah. And as he says, Kulu Kushas, and all of our questions up till now, the Shalosh Regalim, the avoda on these days is not necessarily done by the Kohen Gadol, it's done by Kohanim. Whereas by the Miluim, by Yom Kippur, it's davka done by the Kohen Gadol. So therefore, that makes Yom Kippur a better candidate than any of the other suggestions. V'ikadami Amar Ravina, To those who say that what Ravina says is done in avoda tchila, me avoda tchila, that we learn out a first avoda from a first avoda lafuke hane to the exclusion of all the others lav tchila ninu, that they're not first. My tchila, what does it mean first? Ilemu tchila b'choin gadol. If you say what it means, the first experience of a kohen gadol, meaning the offering of Yom Kippur was the first communal offering that Aharon offered as the kohen gadol, and also the Miluim was the first time that the Kohen Gadol ever served. But if we want to say that we're talking about the first for a Kohen Gadol, well then that's basically similar to the same thing as the first understanding of Ravina, which is that we learn out Avodah of a Kohen Gadol from Avodah of a Kohen Gadol. It's basically the same thing. So Hainu Kamaisa, it's the same thing. Ela Avodah Tchila b'makom, Avodah Tchila b'makom. No, what it means is that the first time in a particular place, that the first time that the first Yom Kippur was the first time that any avodah was ever done in the Kodesh HaKodashim. And the Miluim were also the first time that avodah was ever done on the Mizbeach. Rashi points out, well, technically for 7 days, on the 8th day was the first, the Yoma Shmini, which is the day that we're talking about, is the first time that avodah was ever done on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Rashi points out, well, what about the 7 days prior where Moshe Rabbeinu was doing the avodah on the Mizbeach, but that was sort of like an exceptional, that was like a Yotzei Min HaKlal. Moshe was serving in a white tunic. It was not just like, that was not a normal Kohanim using the Mizbeach thing. So therefore, we want to say that, the second reading of Ravina is that just like Yom Kippur was the first time that the Kodesh HaKodashim was ever used for the Avodah, and the Yom HaShmini L'Miluim was the first day that the Mizbeach was, the first time that the Mizbeach was ever used for Avodah by the Kohanim, to the exclusion of Rosh Hashanah and all the other regalim where there's nothing particularly unique. It's not the first time that something was being done on that day. Alright, sounds good to me. Okie dokie. So I think we're done, at least for now, with trying to figure out if L'chaper is talking about Yom Kippur. The answer seems to be yes. K'asar Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Omar, he said, Rabbi Yochanan Masnichada, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Masnitarte, that Rabbi Yochanan learns out from our pasuk, our beloved pasuk that we've been laboring over since yesterday, this pasuk by the Miluim, by Kasher also by Yomazeh, Tziv Hashem la'asos l'chaper alechem. So the question is la'asos referring to para and l'chaper referring to Yom Kippur, or maybe it's all just a reference to Yom Kippur. So it says Rav Dimi that Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is that it's all just, right, Masnichada. It's all Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Masnitarta, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says it's talking about two things. Let's go weiter. Rabbi Yochanan Masnichada lasas l'chaper l'maisi Yom Kippurim. Rabbi Yochanan says the whole pasuk is talking about one thing, that when it says lasas l'chaper, it's all talking about Yom Kippurim. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Masnitarta lasos l'maisi par l'chaper l'maisi Yom Kippurim. Says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that when the pasuk says lasos, it's referring to the par aduma, that it requires quarantine, and when it says l'chaper, it's referring to Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yochanan Masnichada. How could Rabbi Yochanan possibly say that La'asos L'chaper is only talking about Yom Kippur? We have two Mishnayos. One Mishnah says Shivas Yom Kodem Yom Kippurim, that 7 days before Yom Kippur the Kohen Gadol quarantines. V'Shivas Yom Kodem Shivas Apar. We have another Mishnah that says that 7 days before the slaughtering and burning of the Parah Aduma, the Kohen who's going to do it separates. So how could Rabbi Yochanan possibly say that there's no quarantine for Parah Aduma? Ma'ila ba'alma. So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's not midoraisa. It's a ma'ila ba'alma. Remember we said yesterday that, it was called the Lishkas Ha'even, because everything by the Parah Aduma had to be done with stone vessels that couldn't become tameh, because since they would be matame the Kohen who would burn the Parah Aduma and then put him in the mikvah, so it'll be a Tvul Yom to the exclusion of the Tzedukim. So therefore, to make up for the fact that a Tvul Yom is doing the Parah, we don't want you to get the wrong idea to think that it's not so strict. So therefore, we then become extra strict to make sure everything is done as Tahara. And part of that extra strictness is that he quarantines for 7 days, but it's not really required according to Rabbi Yochanan. What about the Gzer Shava of Tziva Tziva? I don't know what he does. Maybe he didn't have that tradition. But Amar min Yomi Bar Chilkia, Amar Mechaser Bar Idi, Amar B'Yochanan Kasher also B'Yom Hazeh Tziva Hashem Lasos L'Chaper Lechem Lasos Elumaise Par L'Chaper Elumaise Yom Kippurim. But 1 second, We have Rav Minyomi Bar Chilkiah in the name of Rav Machas, in the name of none other than Rabbi Yochanan himself, who says that when the pasuk says Kasher also b'yom hazeh tziv Hashem la'asos lechaper aleichem, la'asos is referring to para, lechaper elumaisa Yom Kippurim. So we see Rabbi Yochanan himself is saying that la'asos is para aduma and lechaper is Yom Kippur. So how could he learn out only one thing from the pasuk? Clearly he's learning out two things. Answers the Gemara Ha'ud Rabbe, that when Rabbi Yochanan says la'asos is para aduma and lechaper is Yom Kippur, that's not his opinion, it's his teacher's opinion. Also Ravin, that when Ravin came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Rabbi Yishmael, which is interesting. Why are we referring to Rabbi Yishmael as the Rebbe of Rabbi Yochanan? They were like nowhere close to each other. Rabbi Yochanan was an Amora, an early Amora, but in Amora, Rabbi Yeshua was like Rabbi Yishmael was a Tana of the generation of Rabbi Akiva. Like, I don't know, like after the generation of Rabbi Yishmael, there was a generation of like Rabbi Yehuda and friends, then the generation of Rebbe, and only after that do we really get to Rabbi Yochanan. So like, I don't know why we're talking to, saying that Rabbi Yochanan's Rebbe would be Rabbi Yishmael, but okay, Beseder comes from the tradition, fine. Rabbi Yishmael is everybody's Rebbe, maybe you could say. I'll go upon him. So la'asos say l'maaseh para, l'chaper l'maaseh Yom Kippurim. That la'asos is referring to para aduma, and l'chaper is talking about Yom Kippur. Fine. So Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, Rabbi Yochanan's own opinion is that only Yom Kippur would be a midoraisa quarantine, but para aduma would not be. Fine. Weiter. Amar le Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. So Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, mehecha koyalaftala mimiluim. So Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, one second, Rabbi Yochanan, do you really learn out that the quarantine of Yom Kippur is derived from the quarantine of the Miluim? By the Miluim, anything that's written by them is Ma'akev. If you don't do it, it won't fly. It doesn't work. Everything must be done, including the quarantine. Well, if we're going to learn out Yom Kippur from Miluim, well then every detail of Yom Kippur should be me'akev, and if you didn't do it, then the avoda is possible. Okay, let's go weiter, shtickle. V'chiteim, if you're going to say achinami, if you're going to say, yeah, sure, everything is me'akev by Yom Kippur. Well, ve'atnanu maskinin lo kohen acher v'lo katani mafrishin. In the Mishnah, it says that we quarantine the kohen gadol for 7 days. And Rabbi Yochanan, if you're learning that out from Miluim, well then, just like Miluim, everything's me'akev, so by Yom Kippur, everything's me'akev, which means that this 7-day quarantine is a must. And if you do not quarantine for 7 days, the avodah of Yom Kippur is null and void, is possible. Okay, that's fine. But listen to this. It says, Umaskin lo kohen acher, v'lo katani mafrishin. We say that we also prepare in a backup kohen gadol in case the actual kohen gadol becomes unfit to do the avodah for whatever reason. Now, it doesn't say mafrishin. It doesn't say that this backup is also quarantining for 7 days. It just says that he's prepared. And if, something happens the day before Yom Kippur, well, this backup is going to step in even though he hasn't been quarantining. Now, if we're saying that the quarantine of Yom Kippur is learned out from Miluim, well, just like by the Miluim, it's a must. By Yom Kippur, then it must also be a must. And therefore, this backup should have to also quarantine, because if something happens to the Kohen Gadol, we need a backup who has been quarantining. And if you want to say, my maskin and mafrishin, and if you want to say, well, when we say that, we appoint a backup, it means he also quarantines. Well, then lesni o idi v'idi maskinin o idi v'idi mafrishin. Well, then how come by the Kohen Gadol it says mafrishin, and by the backup it says maskinin? Be consistent. Say mafrishin in both or maskinin in both, and then I'll say, yeah, they're both quarantining. But if one's mafrishin, that we separate him, i.e. implying quarantine, the other one says maskinin, that we just designate him, that seems to be two separate things. It sounds like the Kohen Gadol is quarantining and the backup is not. So how can you learn it out from Miluim? Because if we learn it out from Miluim, then we would have to make sure that the backup is also quarantining, because if he didn't quarantine, then the avodah wouldn't be kosher. So Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, Rish Lakish, so where do you learn it out from? Amar mi Sinai. So Rish Lakish says, I learned it out from Amar Sinai. Tichsiv is the pasuk says, "Vayishkon kvod Hashem al Har Sinai v'yachaseu adon sheishis yom v'yikra Moshe b'yom hashvi." Period. Let's read that again. Vayishkon kvod Hashem al Har Sinai, that the honor of God rested on the mountain of Sinai, v'yachaseu adon sheishis yomim, and the cloud covered Har Sinai for 6 days. V'yikra Moshe b'yom hashvi, and then the Eibishter called out to Moshe on the 7th day. He said, "Nu kumaran." So we say if the Eibishter only called to Moshe on the 7th day, so what was happening on the first 6 days? So Zebana of, this is a precedent. That anybody who's going into the encampment of the Eibishter needs to quarantine for 6 days. So for 6 days Moshe was quarantining, and then on the 7th day he went to visit God. But we require a 7-day quarantine in the Mishnah. By Har Sinai it was only 6 days. So our Mishnah is Taka Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira is a little bit more stringent, that he says, well, we also have to be concerned about Tumas Beso, that in the event that if 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol was sleeping with his wife, and then she became a Nida while they were sleeping together, so then that he would be considered a Boel Nida would be tummy for 7 days, and then he wouldn't be able to do the Avodah, so out of concern that may be the case, so Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, add another day, quarantine for 7 days. So our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. But Meikar Adin, we learn out from Har Sinai that you have to quarantine for a minimum of 6 days before going to see the Eibishter, which is why the Kohen Gadol quarantines for Lemaisa a week before Yom Kippur. Nu, what do you think about Daf Gimel of Masechta Yoma? It was cool, right? But it was like a shtickle involved. It was like a shtickle middarin. Okay, so let's do a review. So, I'm very happy that the reviews are back. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but yeah, Masechta Shkalim, I don't know what was going on. It was so choppy that it was, I don't know. Masechta Shkalim was an interesting exercise. Let's go weiter, but Masechta Yoma knew, so proving Prisha for Yom Kippur. So the first, I'd say even like 2/3, let's say, of the daf was continuing on our discussion from yesterday of how do you know that lechaper in the pasuk of the pasuk by Miluim, how do you know that lechaper is a reference to Yom Kippur? Maybe it's a reference to other things. So like what? Like Shmini Atzeres. So Mishashi says no, because the pasuk says hazeh kazeh. It has to be exactly like this. Shmini Atzeres as a week of Yontif leading up to it. We need just 7 regular days, and Yom Kippur fills that bill. Rav Ashi fits that bill. Rav Ashi says that it wouldn't make sense that Sukkot itself would not require quarantine, but Shmini Atzeres would. That doesn't really make sense. So therefore it can't be Shmini Atzeres. Weiter. What about Shavuos? Shavuos is 7 regular days leading up to a day of Yom Tov. Says Rav Abba, yeah, but the difference is that on Shavuos you taka bring 2 rams, whereas on Yom Kippur and the Miluim it was taka 1 ram. So it makes it a better comparison. Okay, fine. What about Rosh Hashanah? Why don't we learn out from Rosh Hashanah? Also, 7 days quarantine, 1 day of Yom Tov. So Rabbahu says that, well, by Yom Kippur and by Miluim, the korbanos belong to the Kohen Gadol, as opposed to Rosh Hashanah, where they belong to the community. Rav Ashi says that we learn out 1 chatas and 1 ola, right? That by Yom Kippur and by Miluim, it's 1 chatas and 1 ola, as opposed to Rosh Hashanah, where it's 2 olas. And Ravina gives 2 possibilities of what Ravina says. The first possibility is that, well, by the Miluim and by Yom Kippur, it's both the avodah by the Kohen Gadol, as opposed to the other festivals where it's just regular Kohanim. The other way to understand it is that Yom Kippur and the Miluim was both a first. By Yom Kippur was the first time that avodah was ever done in the Kodesh HaKodashim, and by the Miluim was the first time that the Mizbeach was ever used for the korbanos. As opposed to the other festivals, there's nothing particularly first about them. We have a machlokas of Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi about the prisha for paraduma, the 7-day quarantine for paraduma. Interestingly, Rabbi Yochanan says that it's really just a mila. It's just another thing that we do to make sure that you take the purity of paraduma seriously. But it's not actually midoraisa. What does he do with the gzer shava? I don't know. Maybe he doesn't have that tradition. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says no, it's a chiyuv. When the pasuk says la'asos, it's referring to paraduma, that you quarantine for 7 days for paraduma as well. And then what is the source for the 7-day quarantine of Yom Kippur? So Rabbi Yochanan says it's like what we've been assuming up until now, that when the pasuk says by Miluim lechaper, it's talking about Yom Kippur. Says Rish Lakish, no, it actually comes from Har Sinai, that it says that Moshe Rabbeinu quarantined for 6 days and then went up to God on day 7. So here also we quarantine for a week because we take Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir into account, but that's why we quarantine before Yom Kippur. That was Daf Gimel of Masechta Yoma. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy your day. Cheers.